Imagine walking into the boardroom of a Fortune 500 company and witnessing something that defies everything you've been taught about meritocracy. The CEO, a person who stumbled upward through a series of spectacular failures, each one rewarded with a promotion, is announcing another disastrous strategic decision. Around the table sit brilliant minds, people with decades of expertise, nodding in agreement with ideas they know will destroy the company. Meanwhile, the one person brave enough to voice legitimate concerns is quietly escorted out, their career effectively terminated for the crime of competence. This isn't fiction. This is the rule, not the exception, in how power operates in our world. You've witnessed this paradox countless times, haven't you? The incompetent manager who keeps getting promoted while the hardest workers remain invisible. The politicians who rise to the highest offices despite, or perhaps because of, their stunning inability to govern. The influencers who accumulate millions of followers by peddling dangerous nonsense while genuine experts struggle to be heard above the noise. The pattern is so pervasive, so consistently brutal in its logic, that it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What if our entire understanding of how power works is fundamentally wrong? What if intelligence, competence, and integrity aren't just irrelevant to gaining power? What if they're actually obstacles? Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in the blood-soaked political landscape of Renaissance Italy, observed something that most of us refuse to acknowledge. Power doesn't flow to the deserving. It flows to those who understand its true nature. And that nature is far more disturbing than we want to admit. Machiavelli watched as the most cunning, ruthless, and yes, often foolish individuals seized control while the wise and virtuous were crushed beneath their ambitions. But here's what makes this observation truly terrifying. He wasn't describing a bug in the system. He was describing a feature. 500 years later, modern psychology has given us the tools to understand why this pattern persists across cultures, centuries, and civilizations. We now know about the cognitive biases that make us worship confidence over competence. We understand how narcissistic personalities are naturally drawn to positions of authority, and why we consistently mistake their self-promotion for leadership. We can map the neurological pathways that make us follow charismatic fools into disaster while ignoring the quiet warnings of genuine experts. But knowing these mechanisms exist and understanding why they dominate our world are two entirely different things. Because the truth Machiavelli glimpsed, and that modern research has confirmed, cuts deeper than individual psychology. It reveals something fundamental about the nature of human hierarchies, something that challenges our most sacred beliefs about fairness, justice, and progress. Consider this: every day you participate in systems that reward the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Your workplace, your political institutions, your social networks, all of them are structured in ways that systematically elevate incompetence while suppressing wisdom. You watch it happen. You feel the frustration of seeing less capable people advance while you or others more deserving stagnate. But have you ever asked yourself why this pattern is so universal? Why every culture, every organization, every power structure seems to follow the same perverse logic? The answer isn't that the world is unfair, though it certainly is. The answer isn't that good people finish last, though they often do. The answer is that we've misunderstood the fundamental purpose of power itself. We've confused power with leadership, authority with competence, influence with wisdom. And in making these conceptual errors, we've become complicit in our own subjugation to systems that were designed to fail us. What you're about to discover will shatter your assumptions about how the world really works. It will reveal why your intelligence might be your greatest liability in the pursuit of influence. It will show you how the very qualities that make you valuable as a human being, empathy, honesty, critical thinking, make you vulnerable in the ruthless mathematics of power. And it will force you to confront a question that will haunt you long after you've finished reading. In a world that rewards fools and punishes wisdom, what does it mean to be truly intelligent? The journey we're about to take together will strip away the comfortable illusions that keep us passive and reveal the brutal mechanisms that really govern human affairs. Because only by understanding why power rewards fools can we begin to develop the strategies necessary to survive, and perhaps even change, a world designed to crush anyone foolish enough to believe that merit matters. The root of this perverse system lies buried in the deepest layers of human psychology, where our most primitive instincts clash with our evolved social structures. To understand why power consistently flows to the incompetent, we must first acknowledge a truth that civilized society desperately tries to hide. We are not the rational actors we pretend to be. We are animals wearing masks of sophistication, and our ancient programming still dictates how we respond to displays of dominance. Carl Jung understood this when he wrote about the shadow, that dark aspect of human nature that we refuse to acknowledge but that nevertheless drives our behavior. The shadow doesn't care about competence or wisdom. It responds to power displays, to confidence, to the kind of primitive dominance that our reptilian brains interpret as strength. This is why the loud, aggressive, and often incompetent individual commands attention in ways that the quiet expert never will. Your shadow recognizes something in their performance that bypasses your rational mind entirely. But Jung's insight only scratches the surface. Friedrich Nietzsche saw deeper into the abyss when he identified what he called ressentiment, the psychological poison that infects those who cannot create their own values and instead define themselves through opposition to others. This isn't just envy or jealousy, it's something far more insidious. It's the transformation of weakness into a moral virtue, the elevation of mediocrity into a righteous cause. When societies are dominated by ressentiment, they don't just fail to reward excellence, they actively punish it. Think about how this manifests in your daily life. When you encounter someone with genuine expertise, what's your first instinct? If you're honest, it's often suspicion. We've been conditioned to distrust authority, to be skeptical of those who claim special knowledge. This skepticism isn't entirely wrong. Expertise can be corrupted, credentials can be manufactured. But our response goes far beyond healthy skepticism. We've developed what Nietzsche would recognize as a slave morality that celebrates ignorance as authenticity and mistakes incompetence for relatability. This psychological terrain becomes even more treacherous when we consider what author Schopenhauer revealed about human motivation. Most people, Schopenhauer argued, are driven not by reason but by will, a blind, irrational force that seeks only to perpetuate itself. The will doesn't want truth, it wants victory. It doesn't seek understanding, it seeks dominance. When someone presents you with facts that challenge your worldview, your will doesn't engage in rational deliberation, it goes to war. This is why incompetent leaders can maintain power even in the face of obvious failure. Their followers aren't supporting them because of their competence. They're supporting them because those leaders validate their will, their need to feel powerful by association. The incompetent leader becomes a vessel for their supporters' frustrated desires for agency and control. His failures become irrelevant because he serves a psychological function that has nothing to do with actual leadership. Viktor Frankl, writing from the depths of Nazi concentration camps, identified another crucial element of this puzzle. Most people cannot tolerate the anxiety of freedom and responsibility. They desperately want someone else to make the difficult decisions, to shoulder the burden of choice, to provide meaning in a meaningless universe. This creates what Frankl called an existential vacuum, a hollow space where authentic purpose should exist but doesn't. Into this vacuum step the fools and charlatans, offering simple answers to complex problems, clear enemies to focus hatred upon, and most importantly, relief from the terrible burden of thinking for oneself. The incompetent leader succeeds not despite their incompetence, but because of it. Their simplistic worldview matches the psychological needs of people who cannot bear the complexity of reality. Jean-Paul Sartre understood this when he wrote about bad faith, the lies we tell ourselves to escape the anxiety of authentic existence. We pretend we have no choice, that we're victims of circumstance, that we're powerless to change our conditions. This self-deception makes us vulnerable to those who promise to think for us, to make our choices for us, to relieve us of the burden of authentic existence. But perhaps the most disturbing insight comes from recognizing how our social institutions amplify these psychological weaknesses. Modern democratic systems, corporate hierarchies, and social media platforms all create environments where the loudest, most confident, and often least informed voices rise to the top. We've built machines that systematically reward the worst aspects of human nature while punishing wisdom, nuance, and genuine competence. The fool succeeds because they offer something the wise cannot. The illusion that complex problems have simple solutions, that difficult truths can be ignored, that responsibility can be delegated to others. They succeed because they reflect back to us our own psychological weaknesses and call them strengths. They succeed because they understand, either instinctively or through calculation, that most people would rather be comforted with lies than challenged with truth. This isn't a bug in human psychology, it's a feature. And until we understand why our minds are wired to follow fools into disaster, we'll remain trapped in systems that guarantee our own destruction. The true horror of this system isn't just that it elevates incompetence, it's that it systematically destroys the very foundations of rational discourse and collective problem-solving. You're living through the consequences right now, watching as entire civilizations lose their ability to distinguish between truth and performance, between expertise and entertainment, between leadership and manipulation. And the most insidious part? You've been conditioned to participate in your own intellectual subjugation. Consider what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect, the cognitive bias that causes people with limited knowledge to vastly overestimate their own competence. But here's what most discussions of this phenomenon miss. In a world that rewards confidence over accuracy, Dunning-Kruger isn't just a bias, it's a competitive advantage. The person who knows just enough to be dangerous but not enough to be cautious will consistently outperform the expert who understands the true complexity of any given situation. This creates what we might call the competence trap. The more you actually know about something, the more aware you become of what you don't know, the more cautious you become about making bold claims, and the more nuanced your positions become. Meanwhile, the incompetent person speaks with absolute certainty, offers simple solutions, and projects an aura of decisive leadership. In any public forum, whether it's a corporate meeting, a political debate, or a social media discussion, who do you think the audience will find more compelling? The neurological reality is even more disturbing. Research in cognitive psychology has shown that our brains are hardwired to prefer information that confirms our existing beliefs and to reject information that challenges them. This confirmation bias doesn't just affect how we process new information, it actually changes how we perceive reality itself. When you're presented with evidence that contradicts your worldview, the parts of your brain associated with physical pain light up. Your mind literally experiences challenging information as an attack on your body. Now imagine you're an incompetent leader whose power depends on maintaining certain illusions. You don't need to consciously manipulate people. You simply need to tell them what their brains are already desperate to hear. You become a drug dealer for cognitive comfort, and your audience becomes addicted to the relief you provide from the painful process of thinking. The expert who insists on uncomfortable truths becomes the enemy, not because they're wrong, but because they're right in ways that hurt. This dynamic creates what social psychologists call epistemic closure. Entire communities that become sealed off from contradictory information. But it's more than just echo chambers. It's the systematic construction of alternative realities where incompetence can be rebranded as authenticity, where ignorance becomes a virtue, and where any attempt at nuanced thinking is dismissed as elitist manipulation. You see this most clearly in how modern institutions handle expertise. Universities, once bastions of rigorous inquiry, now operate like customer service centers where students purchase degrees rather than earn knowledge. Media organizations, desperate for clicks and engagement, elevate controversy over accuracy and personalities over substance. Corporate environments reward those who can present simple narratives and punish those who insist on acknowledging complexity. The result is what we might call the Great Flattening, the systematic elimination of hierarchies of competence in favor of hierarchies of charisma and self-promotion. In this flattened world, the opinion of someone who has spent decades studying climate science carries the same weight as the opinion of someone who watched a YouTube video. The insights of a historian who has dedicated their life to understanding the causes of war are dismissed in favor of the hot takes of a podcast host who speaks with more confidence than knowledge. But perhaps the most devastating consequence is how this system destroys the very concept of expertise itself. When competence is consistently unrewarded and incompetence is consistently elevated, rational people begin to question whether expertise actually exists. If the experts are always ignored and the fools are always promoted, maybe there's no meaningful difference between them. Maybe knowledge is just another form of opinion, and all opinions are equally valid. This epistemic relativism isn't just intellectually corrosive, it's existentially dangerous. Complex problems require sophisticated solutions implemented by people who actually understand what they're doing. Climate change, economic inequality, technological disruption, geopolitical instability, these challenges don't care about your political preferences or your psychological comfort zones. They require expertise, nuance, and the kind of careful thinking that our systems actively discourage. Meanwhile, you're trapped in a culture that has gamified ignorance. Social media algorithms reward outrage over insight, simplicity over sophistication, and performance over substance. Every day, you're bombarded with information designed not to inform you but to manipulate your emotional responses, to keep you engaged, angry, and ultimately profitable to the platforms that shape your reality. The incompetent leaders rising to power aren't anomalies. They're the inevitable products of systems that have weaponized your own psychological weaknesses against you. They succeed because they understand something that the experts don't. In a world drowning in information, people don't want more data. They want someone to tell them that their existing beliefs are correct, that their fears are justified, and that someone else is responsible for solving their problems. And so you watch, day after day, as the world becomes increasingly ungovernable, as problems multiply faster than solutions, as the very idea of rational discourse collapses under the weight of weaponized stupidity. You feel the growing sense that something fundamental has broken, that the center cannot hold, that the systems that once guaranteed some minimal level of competence in leadership have been corrupted beyond repair. But what you may not realize is that your growing despair isn't just a rational response to irrational times, it's also a trap. Because as long as you believe the system is broken rather than working exactly as designed, you'll continue to wait for someone else to fix it instead of understanding how to navigate it yourself. Here's the radical shift in perspective that changes everything. The moment you stop trying to fix the system and start learning to see through it, you gain a power that the incompetent leaders desperately fear, the power of clarity in a world built on illusion. This isn't about becoming cynical or abandoning your principles. This is about developing what we might call Machiavellian wisdom, the ability to understand how power really works while maintaining your ethical center. The first step in this rebellion is recognizing that you've been playing by rules that were designed to ensure your failure. You've been taught to believe that competence will be rewarded, that hard work leads to advancement, that telling the truth is always the best policy. These beliefs aren't just naive, they're actively harmful in a world where power operates according to entirely different principles. The competent person who insists on highlighting problems rather than promising solutions will be dismissed. The hard worker who focuses on results rather than visibility will be ignored. The truth teller who complicates simple narratives will be marginalized. But here's what the fools who currently hold power don't understand. Their success depends on your continued participation in their illusions. The moment you stop believing that the emperor has clothes, you become immune to the psychological manipulation that keeps everyone else in line. This is why totalitarian regimes throughout history have been so terrified of individuals who simply refuse to pretend that obvious lies are true. It's not that these dissidents pose a physical threat, it's that their clarity threatens the entire structure of shared delusion that makes authoritarian control possible. Consider the historical examples of those who broke free from these systems. Socrates didn't try to reform Athens by playing by the rules of Athenian politics. He exposed the ignorance of those who claimed to possess wisdom. Gandhi didn't defeat the British Empire through conventional political channels. He used the empire's own contradictions against itself. Frederick Douglass didn't escape slavery by appealing to the moral consistency of slaveholders. He educated himself and spoke truths that made their justifications impossible to maintain. What these figures understood is that real power doesn't come from accumulating official titles or social recognition, it comes from the ability to see reality clearly and speak about it authentically. When you develop this clarity, something remarkable happens. You stop being manipulable. The emotional appeals that work on others bounce off you. The false promises that seduce the masses leave you unmoved. The charismatic performances that mesmerize crowds become transparent displays of insecurity and compensation. This psychological immunity is more threatening to incompetent leaders than any external opposition because it's contagious. When people encounter someone who isn't playing the game, who isn't performing the expected scripts, who isn't responding to the usual triggers, it reminds them that they have choices they've forgotten about. Your refusal to participate in collective delusions gives others permission to wake up from their own. But developing this clarity requires what might seem like a paradox. You must become simultaneously more ruthless and more compassionate than you've ever been. Ruthless in your commitment to seeing things as they actually are, regardless of how uncomfortable those truths might be. Ruthless in refusing to enable incompetence, even when that refusal makes you unpopular. Ruthless in protecting your mental space from the propaganda machines that want to colonize your attention. And yet, you must also become more compassionate, not toward the systems that exploit people, but toward the people trapped within those systems. Most of the individuals supporting incompetent leaders aren't evil. They're afraid, confused, and desperate for meaning in a world that seems increasingly chaotic. They've been offered simple explanations for complex problems, clear enemies to blame for their suffering, and the promise that someone else will take responsibility for fixing everything. Your compassion comes from understanding that you could easily have been one of them. Your clarity comes from recognizing that their psychological needs are real even if their chosen solutions are disastrous. This combination of ruthless honesty and compassionate understanding creates a form of influence that operates according to completely different principles than the manipulation tactics used by incompetent leaders. Instead of telling people what they want to hear, you help them develop the capacity to hear difficult truths. Instead of promising simple solutions, you teach them how to think through complex problems. Instead of offering to take responsibility for their lives, you show them how to reclaim their own agency. This approach is slower than demagoguery, more difficult than manipulation, and less immediately gratifying than propaganda. But it creates something that incompetent leadership cannot: genuine transformation. The rebellion begins when you realize that you don't need permission from corrupt institutions to live according to your values. You don't need validation from incompetent authorities to know that your insights have merit. You don't need the approval of systems designed to reward conformity to pursue excellence on your own terms. This is the secret that Machiavelli understood but that most readers of The Prince miss. True power isn't about dominating others, it's about becoming undominable yourself. When you can no longer be bought, threatened, flattered, or deceived, you become a force that incompetent leaders cannot predict, control, or contain. You become dangerous not because you seek to destroy them, but because your very existence proves that their power is an illusion that only works on those who choose to believe in it. The fool in power succeeds only as long as enough people continue to participate in the theater of their competence. Your rebellion isn't about storming the castle. It's about walking away from the performance entirely and inviting others to join you in reality. And now we arrive at the deepest truth, the revelation that makes everything else suddenly, brilliantly clear. Power doesn't reward fools by accident. It rewards them by design. Because in a world where real wisdom would demand fundamental changes to how we live, how we organize society, and how we relate to each other and the planet, incompetent leadership serves a crucial function. It maintains the status quo while creating the illusion of change. Think about this carefully. What would happen if genuinely wise, competent leaders actually took control of our major institutions? They would immediately begin solving the problems that incompetent leaders merely talk about. They would implement policies based on evidence rather than ideology. They would make the difficult decisions that require short-term sacrifice for long-term benefit. They would tell people uncomfortable truths about consumption, responsibility, and the real costs of our lifestyle choices. In other words, they would threaten every vested interest, every comfortable delusion, every profitable dysfunction that our current systems depend upon. The fossil fuel industry doesn't want leaders who actually understand climate science. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't want leaders who prioritize public health over profit margins. The military-industrial complex doesn't want leaders who question the necessity of endless conflict. The financial sector doesn't want leaders who understand the difference between productive investment and predatory speculation. Incompetent leaders are perfect for these interests because they can be easily controlled, their failures can be blamed on external enemies, and their obvious inadequacies make the population so desperate for change that they'll accept any alternative, even if that alternative is just another incompetent leader with different branding. This is the ultimate Machiavellian insight. The appearance of democracy, meritocracy, and rational governance serves to legitimize systems that are actually designed to prevent democracy, meritocracy, and rational governance. The incompetent leader is not a bug in the system. They are the system working exactly as intended by those who profit from incompetence. But here's where this revelation becomes truly transformative. Once you understand that the game is rigged, you realize that you've been asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking, how do I succeed within this system? You should be asking, how do I create value outside this system? Instead of, how do I get these institutions to recognize my worth? You should be asking, how do I build institutions that actually serve human flourishing? Instead of, how do I compete with incompetent leaders for their positions? You should be asking, How do I make their positions irrelevant? This shift in questioning changes everything. It transforms you from a victim of corrupt systems into an architect of better alternatives. It moves you from reactive frustration to proactive creation. It liberates you from the exhausting cycle of hoping that this time, somehow, the system will reward merit instead of manipulation. The ultimate truth is that real power has never come from positions or titles or institutional recognition. Real power comes from the ability to create value, solve problems, and inspire others to do the same. The incompetent leaders who currently occupy positions of authority are parasites feeding off the genuine creativity and productivity of people like you. They produce nothing, create nothing, solve nothing. They merely extract value from the real work being done by others. When you understand this, you realize that you don't need their permission to lead. You don't need their validation to create. You don't need their platforms to influence others. What you need is the courage to build something better and the wisdom to build it in ways that make their interference irrelevant. History's greatest advances have never come from reforming corrupt institutions. They've come from making those institutions obsolete. The printing press didn't reform the gatekeepers of information. It made them irrelevant. The internet didn't reform traditional media. It created entirely new ways for information to flow. Cryptocurrency isn't reforming traditional banking. It's creating alternative financial systems. Your generation has tools that no previous generation has ever possessed. You can communicate directly with millions of people without asking permission from media gatekeepers. You can create and distribute value without requiring approval from institutional authorities. You can organize communities, build movements, and implement solutions without waiting for incompetent leaders to get out of your way. The fool in power is terrified of this reality. They know that their authority depends on your continued belief that they are necessary. They know that their influence relies on your acceptance of artificial scarcity, the false belief that opportunities, resources, and platforms are limited and must be distributed through their systems. But scarcity is the old paradigm. Abundance is the new reality. In a world where information, tools, and connections are increasingly abundant, the only real scarcity is wisdom. The ability to see through illusions, to think clearly about complex problems, and to act with integrity in the face of pressure to conform. This is your true inheritance. Not the corrupt institutions you've inherited, but the unprecedented power to create alternatives to them. Not the broken systems you've been taught to navigate, but the opportunity to build systems that actually work. Not the incompetent leaders you've been trained to follow, but the chance to develop the wisdom necessary to lead yourself and others towards something better. The question isn't whether power rewards fools. Of course it does. The question is whether you'll continue to grant that power legitimacy by participating in its theater of competence, or whether you'll walk away from the performance and begin writing a completely different script. The choice has always been yours. The only thing that's changed is that now you know you have it. In the end, Machiavelli's brutal truth isn't a condemnation, it's a liberation. Once you understand how the game really works, you're free to stop playing it and start creating something worth playing instead. The fool's power is an illusion that depends on your participation. Your wisdom is a reality that belongs entirely to you.